I'll be talking today about the case method in philosophy. This is a method that is part of philosophy dating back at least to the time of Plato, featured both in Western and in Eastern philosophical traditions. We think about particular scenarios and we try to elicit some kind of judgment about them. We think of a situation and we ask ourselves, would this be the moral thing to do? We describe a piece of human behavior and we ask, is this person free at this moment? Is this a free choice? We describe a judgment and we ask ourselves whether it's belief or knowledge. And it's a very interesting method, and I think philosophy has recently, especially with the help of experimental philosophy, become quite self-conscious about the character of this method, about the nature of our activity as we reflect on particular cases. And this talk today is a contribution to that. I'm going to be actually trying to get even a little bit more self-conscious about the case method and look at some of its pitfalls and some of its potentials. In particular, I'm going to be looking at this idea of stipulation. What goes on when I'm telling you the story before I even ask you the question? What's happening when I'm doing that? And I'm going to try to argue that what happens when I tell you the story, something that is naturally perceived perhaps a little differently from the perspective of the experimenter who's designing the story to be told and the naive participant who's listening to the story and maybe trying to figure out how she or he is going to respond to it. There's actually some systematic differences in the way the story looks to the experimenter who's using it as a tool and to the naive participant who is enjoying it as a narrative of some kind. So I'll give some sort of general worries about the shift in perspective from the sophisticated experimenter to the naive participant. And I'll run through a case study of some stories and some pairs of stories that motivated a position in epistemology known as interest-relative invariantism. Interest-relative invariantism originally came out as a traditional armchair-driven approach in philosophy, and it got certain challenges from experimental philosophy. And at the end, I'll try to extract some lessons, both for experimental philosophy and for traditional philosophy. It's actually my view that what goes on in experimental philosophy is pretty similar to what goes on in traditional philosophy. So some of the lessons that I'm extracting specifically for XFI apply to our traditional friends as well. So first, I'll just say something very brief about what I think is going on in the case method. This is supposed to be a very rough characterization, nothing very philosophically controversial. I think it helps to start with a specific case. So this is a case from the Indian philosopher Dharmatara from about the year 770. And it's in his commentary on Dharmakirti's theory of knowledge. He actually goes through a series of possible definitions or analyses of knowledge. What is knowledge? The one he's talking about when he brings up this story is the identification of knowledge as the mental state that supports successful action. Who is the person who knows? He's the person who gets it right as far as his action is concerned in the world. And here's a story. You have a thirsty desert traveler who's looking down into the valley ahead of him and hallucinates that there's an oasis there. And he forms the judgment there's water in the valley. As luck would have it, there is water in the valley. It's just in a well, which is hidden under the sand. And Dharmatara asks, does our traveler know that there is water in the valley as he stands up at the crest of the hill? And of course it's explained, on the strength of his hallucination. Let's say he does go down into the valley and then he finds the water. So that was a mental state which ends up supporting successful action for him. He wanted water and he got some. But did he know? And Dharmatara feels that he didn't. And those of us who are familiar with the Gettier case tradition may recognize this as a Gettier case. Dharmatara actually has a number of fabulous ones. So here's a question. What is it that we're learning when we think about hypothetical cases like this. Very much at the object level, Dharmatara would say you can learn, for example, that knowledge cannot simply be identified as the state of mind that supports successful action. That's an unsuccessful definition of knowledge or analysis of knowledge. More generally, I think there are various things you can learn. And here are two things you can learn, two types of things you can learn, which are sometimes somewhat difficult to disentangle from each other. On the one hand, you can learn things about your intuitive capacities themselves. So you can learn by looking at how people respond to these stories, something about how people respond to stories, how people intuitively attribute states of knowledge and mere belief to others. What kinds of conditions prompt an intuitive classification as a situation as being one of knowledge or not. Then more boldly, when things are going well, you can learn something about the targets of these intuitive capacities of ours. So we seem to have an intuitive capacity to distinguish between knowing that something's the case and thinking that something's the case. That distinction is made in all known natural languages, and it's made very frequently. These are among our most common verbs. It's made systematically. There is a systematic difference between describing someone as knowing something and just thinking it. And I like to think that this intuitive capacity is not just random noise. I like to think that it's actually part of our social intelligence, that we're capable of recognizing when people know things and when they just think them to be the case. I don't think it's infallible. I think, as I'm sure all my epistemology and especially my X5 friends would say, there are times when our intuitive capacities let us down and we think that people know things and they don't actually know them, and there could actually be some systematic ways in which the capacity lets us down. There could be certain blind spots of this capacity, but I think on the whole we are entitled to start with a relatively non-skeptical attitude to our intuitive capacities. Of course, if you started with a completely skeptical attitude, for example, moral capacities, and you thought, well, human moral judgments have no likelihood whatsoever of leading you closer to the truth about good and evil, I think you would you'd be in a pretty difficult epistemological predicament pretty quickly. And I don't think there's a lot of independent reason to support that kind of skeptical attitude. Okay, so this is what I think might be going on with hypothetical cases. And then something about the fact that they're intuitive has to be taken into account. I think the key characteristic of intuitive as opposed to reflective processing is that access to conscious working memory is not required for intuitive processing. So the classic example, if I ask you to multiply 7 by 11, you're going to get an answer spontaneously, involuntarily, without awareness of any sequence of steps, any reasoning producing that answer. If you look at this the right way, you might recognize that as a picture of Marilyn Monroe. You don't actually know, and in fact I don't think you have introspective access to what the features of that array of dots are that would make you recognize it as her. You recognize the emotions in other people's faces, whether they're sad or angry or afraid. You might actually even have theories about how you're doing that. Those theories are very likely wrong. It's not about the corners of the mouth. It's about weird stuff involving geometry of the eyebrows and so on. And so you're not necessarily aware of, in the first place, the processing. So multiplying 7 by 11 is very different from dividing the number 7 by 11. If you try to go through that long division, you'll be aware of an explicit series of stages. It won't be a particular mystery why you've ended up at the result that you get. Similarly, explicit syllogistic reasoning, where you have to be aware of the stages, is less mysterious in character than intuitive processing, where you find yourself with a response. As Steve Sloan puts it, you're aware of the product but not the process. This is an interesting feature of intuitive judgment. And we want to say in general, just the fact that you're not aware of the process doesn't mean that there's anything stupid about it. It can be very intelligent and very computationally rich. And intuition and this kind of immediate judgment actually can tell us a lot about the world, but it tells us about it in ways that are not necessarily transparent to us. So thinking about how cases manage to elicit intuitions, We can introduce some vocabulary. So we tell a story as a philosopher, as an experimentalist, that we expect the reader to understand as involving certain basic features. So I might tell a story about a mental state that supports successful action. And I want to, as I tell the story of the man in the desert who goes down and gets the water, I want it to be relatively uncontroversial, that his action was successful. Or I describe, a scenario in which there's some kind of random motion caused by a muscle spasm. And then after I tell you these stories, I ask you a question about what I'll call some feature of interest. So I'll ask you, is this knowledge? Is this a free action? And from the experimenter's perspective, you have a division between basic features, which are going to be the input to the relevant intuitive capacity that you're probing. And as an experimenter, you want to be telling the reader about those features. And features of interest, which are going to be the features that are intuitively calculated by the reader. And as an experimenter, you want to be asking the reader about those features. You don't want your story, of course, to explicitly stipulate that this is a free action, or there's no engagement of the relevant intuitive capacity here. So this looks really simple. It's going to turn out to be actually more complicated than it appears, and it's in part because, to the extent that we're looking at intuitive judgments to give us information about the target, it's typically because we haven't decoded the relevant, if you want, programming of the relevant intuitive capacities yet. So we know that a lot of different features go into our recognition of states of knowledge and belief in other people. In live action, you're looking at things like direction of gaze. You can tell that I know that there's water in this bottle from the way I'm looking, from the sounds that you're hearing, from the things that I'm saying and doing. All of those are cues to, or input to the capacity to attribute knowledge. But until we know exactly how the capacity works, we don't know what are the basic features, what inputs are and aren't relevant. We don't know that yet. It's a little bit of a mystery to us exactly, first, what knowledge itself is, and secondly, how it's intuitively detected in human beings. So these capacities are somewhat mysterious. It's not just introspectable to us, what we look at when we're doing things like detecting emotion or detecting knowledge. These are kind of mysterious capacities. So it can be tricky to delimit and stipulate appropriately exactly what the basic features are in the story. Sometimes people are responding to a story, but not for the reasons that you expect them to be responding to it. So I want to talk a little bit about stories and the two perspectives that you can take on them, the perspective of the subject and the perspective of the experimenter. So I want to forget for a moment that we are philosophers who are probably very familiar with this case, especially as it was just, oh, wait, sorry. First I'll say, I'm going to talk about a very famous case, but first I'll just say something about the way that stories are read. And I don't know if you can see this. It's in the public, this is in the public domain. But this is a train schedule. And this column right here indicates departure times. Can anybody answer the question about whether there's a train departing Union Station at 8:05? Yes or no? Just no. Okay, that's right. And how did you know that? Well, you knew that because you took what's called a closed world reading of the train schedule. What you actually saw was an absence of information. That question, is there a train departing at 8:05, is different from the question, is there a train departing at 6:55? You would verify that by seeing it explicitly stipulated in the schedule. The train schedule does not have to explicitly stipulate that there are no trains departing at other times. You understand that to be the case because you take a closed world reading of this material. You take all relevant truths to be explicitly stated, and sometimes people will even describe the closed world assumption in very strong terms, like anything that's not explicitly on the list is false. Train schedules are read this way, but very, very few other things are. Most of what we read in what's called an open world format. So we bring our own background knowledge to bear. We fill in gaps. We don't infer the falsity of a claim from its absence, typically. That's how, I mean, read a novel or something like that. The protagonist takes an early morning train. You do not infer that that there are no other trains, right? You're reading open world on that. And in particular, your experimental participants can be expected to read things the way you read things that aren't train schedules, the way you read most of the material you encounter in your life, which is in an open world way. And here's the risk. As an experimenter, because you're very naturally focused on changes in explicit stipulation, especially when you're doing something like trying to set up a minimal pair of cases. There's just one little difference you're going to tweak. It's very easy for you to focus on what's explicitly stipulated and move a little bit in the direction of a closed world reading of those texts. So if I didn't tell you I was changing anything else, I haven't changed anything else, because you're just supposed to focus on what's explicitly given in the story. And that's maybe a little bit of a risk. We'll see some places where that risk might be a problem. Again, readers naturally tend to go open world. So, so when I say there's two perspectives on the case, I might schematize them something like this. From the experimenter's perspective, I've got a story to tell, which I take it has some kind of input of basic features. And so the basic features in a narrative, which elicits a judgment about knowing and thinking, the basic features might be descriptions of what the subject of the case is experiencing, saying, doing. And I'm going to really focus on what I've explicitly stipulated in my story. And then I see that getting producing a judgment, and I'll make some kind of interpretation of the significance of that judgment, often looking pretty closely at the relationships between my explicit stipulations and the outcome of judgment. As a naive reader, when I read a story, I'll appreciate the explicitly stated basic features, plus also the intuitively calculated ones, which are the ones that you bring in when you're just trying to make sense of the story. We'll see something about intuitive calculation in a minute. And then again, I produce a judgment. And I'm not always conscious of the difference between what's been explicitly stated and what I'm intuitively calculating. So one of the things I'm going to try to argue for is the thesis that experimenters might be sometimes telling their participants more than they think they're telling them, or less in some situations. So we're going to very naturally focus on small changes in what's explicitly stipulated, but small changes in what's explicitly stipulated can generate larger changes in what is implicitly understood. And that can be especially true in between subjects designs. If you have juxtaposed cases where the reader gets to evaluate side by side, they're often and only one little change is made, they're going to be more naturally cued to try to construe the stories as being the same except for that one little change. If you're just looking at a story on its own, some feature of it might take you in a direction quite different from the direction you would have gone if you'd looked at the other member of its so-called minimal pair on its own. So that's going to be kind of a risk. Another risk is that the intuitive capacity we're trying to investigate could be brought to bear just in making sense of the initial stipulations, even before we've moved to the target judgment that the philosopher or experimenter is interested in. And lastly, you're not usually aware of the line between what's explicitly stated and what was generated intuitively. So you can go back to the 1980s for this. Lynn Rader did some really excellent work where she gave people little stories. They had to answer questions about the stories. These questions could be answered either on the basis of remembering verbatim some little phrase from or sentence from the story, or reconstructing something that the story makes plausible. And she found that people couldn't really tell which of these two strategies they were using. They're often not really conscious of whether they're getting something verbatim from the story or they're just expressing something that the story made plausible in some way. We're not usually conscious of that. You have a precise verbatim record of what was said, but it's very fragile. It degenerates almost immediately. Typically, you preserve the gist and not the wording. And that's not a bad thing. It's just something to sometimes be aware of when you're interpreting your results. Anne Britt has a recent paper which is really great, just on the fragility of this verbatim recall. It's called something like, "What did I just agree to?" and it just goes into the sort of strange effect of almost immediate forgetting of passages that you're supposed to be evaluating. You've forgotten them before you've even evaluated them half the time. Okay, so I'm bringing up this example, which Hamid also mentioned, not because I think it's a bad example of anything. I think it's actually a classic example, terrific example of a Gettier case, and a really useful one. I'm going to ask you, even though you just heard about it earlier today, I'm going to ask you to just take a moment and just read over the story, just like you're a naive participant, to try to get the intuition about the case at the end. Okay. All right, so that's the story. And as this audience would know quite well, here's a standard takeaway from it. The standard takeaway is that Bob has a justified true belief that Jill owns an American car, but he doesn't know that she does. He didn't know about that switcheroo with her car. He was just lucky that the car that she purchased happened to be also an American car. And the standard epistemologist thing to say about this story is that it shows that knowledge isn't equivalent to justified true belief, right? That's standard, right? We're good with that slide? Okay. So here's my question for you about that story. What kind of car does Jill now drive? Anyone? Thank you. Here's the question I really care about. Did the story stipulate that that Jill now drives a Pontiac? Did the story stipulate that? She bought one?
Her friend gave her one.
Her friend gave her one? Did the story stipulate that she now has a Pontiac, that she owns a Pontiac?
She replaced it with a Pontiac.
She replaced it with a Pontiac. Actually, that's not...
Stolen.
No, the Buick was stolen. She got a Pontiac. Okay, so this is interesting because here's what the story says. The story doesn't directly declare that Jill is a Pontiac owner. It actually nests Jill's Pontiac ownership in a mental state attribution to Bob. Actually, an attribution of ignorance. Bob is also not aware that Jill has replaced it with a Pontiac. I mean, I want to be clear. The story actually does communicate to you exactly what you took from it, that Jill now owns a Pontiac. That's right, she does. But it did it in this, interestingly, slightly indirect way. This is going to matter to us in a moment. Now, of course, we want the story to convey that Jill's a Pontiac owner, right? Because it's just not going to do that trick of showing this is JTB but not K if it's really ambiguous in the story what is even true of Jill at the end. We want it to convey this. And we're going to say, yeah, by saying that Bob isn't aware that she replaced it with a Pontiac, we are actually conveying that she did replace it with a Pontiac by saying that he's not aware of this. And why is that? It's because, in fact, a very familiar point, know that, realize that, is aware that, those are all factive constructions, right? So they presuppose the truth of the embedded clause. And typically, if you have ordinary sentential negation, presupposition is preserved under that. So if I say Mary didn't know that her ex-husband was stalking her, I'm communicating to you something about Mary's ignorance, and I'm simultaneously communicating to you something about Mary's ex-husband. Or likewise here, he wasn't aware that she'd replaced her stolen car Buick with a Pontiac. So I'm communicating this to you. But here's some kind of interesting thing. It's not strictly entailed. This frame of words doesn't strictly entail the truth of the complement clause, because it's possible to take this sentence here, which I said, if you just had this sort of unelaborated, Mary didn't know that her ex-husband was stalking her, I'd be telling you her ex-husband's stalking her. But I can go on and say, because in fact he wasn't. Now here I'm canceling presupposition. Mary was experiencing paranoid delusions, right? I could elaborate it this way. And this is something that's going to show you actually didn't directly get stipulated that Mary had a Pontiac. I'm forgetting everybody's names. Jill's the one with the Pontiac. I didn't directly stipulate that, or Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch, whose very good vignette that originally was. They didn't directly stipulate that, but you figured it out. And you weren't aware that you had inferred it. You weren't aware, I mean, typically we're not. We're not aware of the difference between what we're told verbatim and conversational implicature, even though I gave you every possible cue to like, open your eyes, I'm gonna trick you. All right, so that's kind of interesting. And sort of the interesting question is like, why would we use this kind of construction if typically Mary didn't know would carry that implicature that her ex-husband is stalking her? Typically, if somebody's paranoid and they've got this crazy idea that their ex-husband is stalking them, you'd deliver that thought by saying something like, Mary thought that her ex-husband was stalking her. That's typically what I'd say. I typically wouldn't go for this more elaborate way of speaking, but there are contexts in which the more elaborate way of speaking is precisely what you want. Look at this interchange between John and Paul. John says, and then Mary wouldn't go out after dark because she knew her ex-husband was stalking her. And Paul says, Mary didn't know that her ex was stalking her. He wasn't. She was paranoid. Paul's use of the verb to know there is what's called echoic use. He's picking it up from John. He's picking up John's presupposition, and but this might be meta-linguistic negation. He's saying that's not quite the right vocabulary item there. But if you don't have any special reason to expect meta-linguistic negation, yeah, no one ever expects meta-linguistic negation, then you're not going to interpret the sentence that way, and we didn't. But we can create problems for this. So just say a couple quick things before I say what the problem is. Okay, typically, presupposition is what's in the common ground between the two people who are speaking to each other. So if Tom says to Bob, oh, Jane doesn't know that the meeting was canceled, typically that would be in a situation where it's common knowledge between Tom and Bob that the meeting's been canceled, and that the point of the utterance is an utterance about Jane's ignorance. So that's already in the common ground. So this might kind of make you think, wait a minute, how are we stipulating things using these negated factives? How can we be bringing new information to the table? Like what? It's supposed to be common ground between the experimenter and their naive participants that Jill has recently bought a Pontiac? Like, wasn't that part of the news that you were sharing by using the verb? And in fact, if you look at how factives are actually used, they're used to bring in fresh information to the common ground all the time. So I don't know if you guys know Jennifer Spenner's work. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She's in Sweden. She actually did some really exhaustive empirical research on how people use factives in vivo. So she's working with the London Lund corpus for this particular paper on factive presuppositions from 2003. And the London Lund corpus is a massive database of spoken English from all kinds of sources, some of which seem dubiously ethical, like recorded telephone conversations. I don't know quite what went on with that. And she actually did a sort of exhausting task of going through these conversations, looking at when people used factives and trying to classify, does this information seem to be new? Is it being introduced to the common ground? Is it something that both participants already knew about? Or is it kind of hard to tell? And she found actually, well, in her study, I think 58% of the time, the information that's being brought in is something that's new, coming onto the table for the first time. Maybe 20% of the time it's clear that most people knew it already, and then there's the rest breaks down into sometimes it's not clear, or it might be old, might be new. But she has all these great sort of spontaneously recorded conversations of people using factives. I really like this one. I feel like I have to read this out. Speaker A says, when I worked on the railways these many years ago, I was working in the claims department at Protona Station, Warmington, as office boy for a short time. And one noticed that the tremendous number of claims against the railway companies were people whose fingers had been caught indoors as the porters had slammed them. And Speaker B says, really? Oh my goodness. And so it's pretty clear that this embedded statement here is not something that Speaker B knew already, but there you are using a factive to bring it in, to bring it to the table. So just because something's presupposed doesn't mean that it can't be brought in as new information. You accommodate with your conversational partners. And actually, I think this method of going to the corpus data and looking at how people are actually using these words is something that experimentalists could make much more use of. So we talk a lot about usage. I think looking at usage in the wild can be very informative. Okay, so one of the things I want to say now is the line between input and output on a case. Here are the things I'm telling you. Now, what are the things you're going to tell me back? That line shifts depending on what I'm interested in as an experimenter. Unfortunately, the line also shifts for the reader depending on what they're being explicitly told and what they're being asked. So when we posed it as a Getty case, we all took for granted that Jill drives a Pontiac. In fact, you even thought that I'd stipulated that explicitly. But we could use the same sentence, actually, to test whether readers understand knows that to be factive. And so people have started sort of trying to test this. Like, wait a minute, is knows that really factive or not? But there's some difficulty with this. Of course, you have to ask a different question at the end if you're asking basically whether the presupposed the embedded statement is accepted as true. Asking that question itself can change how the reader understands the text, however, and you can get some sort of strange effects from that people reinterpret the whole exchange in a way that kind of undermines the ordinary function of a factive. So, as I said before, if you have an ordinary usage of a factive verb, this is either common knowledge between the participants at the get-go, or if Bob didn't already know that the meeting has been rescheduled, he knows it now because he's going to accommodate to understand that utterance. It's either existing common ground or being added to common ground. It's not controversial. But what if I had a factive statement like this? Susan knows that Tom was promoted, followed immediately by the question, well, was he? Was he really? Was he promoted? What I'm doing just by asking that question is I'm threatening to take that out of common ground. And if I do that, I can get you to sort of reinterpret what I meant by that initial use of the factive verb. So the flat literal reading, which is kind of what you hope your participants are going to do when you start giving them experimental surveys on factive verbs, is to just respond, yes, Tom was promoted. You said that he knows that she knows that he's promoted. Why are you even asking me that? But that's the problem. Why are you even asking me that? That's a pragmatic problem in how this exchange is being understood. If you get clever on this and you take the experimenter, I mean, here I am, I'm in an experiment. This person can't be asking me this stupid question. The question becomes non-trivial, and then you can shift to a projected reading of knows. Oh yeah, Susan knows, all right. Where you're really meaning to convey something like it seems to Susan that she knows. So it can actually be experimentally difficult to calculate how people are understanding stories, because sometimes the simplest things you want people to take away from the story, if you start questioning them about those elements, they're going to stop taking them away. So that can be a little bit tricky. There are of course, I'm not saying this is an insurmountable problem. There's easy ways to deal with it. Actually, no, there's sometimes quite difficult ways to deal with it. But we've got to be very conscious of the pragmatics of our question asking as we work with these scenarios. That's actually something that's that psychologists have been aware of for a very long time. I encourage you all to go to the dustiest corners of your library and, or email me, and I can email this to you, and dig up Bernard Muschio's 1916 British Journal of Psychology paper on the influence of the form of a question. I don't know if you guys have read this paper. It's magnificent. So this is from the dawn of what was then known as the moving picture. And he showed a series of roughly 30-second moving pictures to his experimental participants. And these just showed little interactions, two guys in a room talking, an outdoor scene down by Marble Arch where there's some traffic going by. And then after they saw the clip, and they would even see it several times, he would ask different kinds of questions. So you might ask, was there a gun on the table? Did you see the gun on the table? Was the gun on the table a revolver or a pistol? You know, you can think of the kinds of questions that you could ask. He was just fooling with basically the form of the question. These are shaded here, and the darker it gets, the more leading the question. So he scored all these questions on various axes of caution, suggestiveness, and I forget the third one, maybe reliability or something like that. Basically looking at what kinds of questions can you ask people in order to get them to report that they saw the nurse on the bicycle in the story, when in fact there was no nurse on it. There wasn't even a bicycle, right? But if you ask the question just right, people will respond to it. And with these questions, people had the option of saying, I don't know, I didn't see it, or of giving a substantive answer of one kind or another. So the question you ask is always part of the story you are telling. And questions can presuppose things, questions can suggest things in ways that as experimentalists we've got to be very conscious of. And just again on the pragmatics, from the perspective of the experimenter, I don't mean to be doing anything funny with my question, but I might inadvertently be doing that. Okay. So I'm suggesting there can be a shift in perspective, maybe something having to do with the pragmatics between the experimenter and the participant. I want to actually work through a particular case study of some literature which I think has maybe gone down the wrong path here. So this is the literature on stake sensitivity in knowledge description. And I'm actually going to start with some psychological background, which is not directly on point. The psychological background has to do with adaptive decision making. So as human beings, we do not invest the same time and energy in every single decision that we make. Thank God for that. If you're making a really high stakes decision, like which graduate school to go to, you've been admitted to several, you're weighing them against each other, you're going to draw up pros and cons and agonize about it, and think about it for a while. If it's just, chicken versus tuna salad at lunch, you might not spend that much. We hope you're going to be hungry if you spend that much time. And there's just an absolutely huge body of literature in psychology and behavioral econometrics on this. And I'm not going to talk about this all. But there's a lot of very, very detailed work and some fabulous sort of mathematical models. It's pretty easy to check that there is this effect going on. So you can have just situations where people have to, for example, purchase bits of evidence. Each bit of evidence costs, a lot of this work is done in business school, so they actually do it with cash. Each bit of evidence that you pick, that you select before you answer the question, costs you 50 cents. And you can pick as much or as little evidence as you want, and then you have to give your answers. Maybe you're under time limits, maybe you're not. And then we'll just manipulate how big the cash reward is for getting this particular question right. Extremely unsurprisingly, people purchase much more information for high value questions. And there are all kinds of models about how you do that and why you do that. And of course, in real life, we do this too. If we're under time pressure, we behave differently. But in general, our thinking is adaptive. That is, decision-making behavior is like all other behavior, right? It's something that we do in part with an eye on costs and benefits. Costs and increased evidence collection and evidence weighing can be offset by gains in accuracy for important questions. Now, it's not true that in general people who are high stakes decision makers always collect more evidence and think harder. Sometimes they're not willing to, and sometimes they're not able to. For example, sometimes they might be extremely biased towards one answer rather than another. They're in a situation involving wishful thinking, prejudice, something like that. Or they might be unable to because they're distracted or they're under time pressure. And again, there's a huge amount of empirical literature on that. This is all very not surprising, right? Okay, so I think there's actually a relationship between that literature and epistemological cases like these, which will be familiar to those of you who are in epistemology. So there may be a shift between how we intuitively evaluate the mental states of people who are in very low stakes, casual decision-making contexts, and people who are in very high stakes life or death situations. So this is a story which originally traces back to Keith DeRose, but this is Jason Stanley's telling of it, about a couple of people who are at a bank. And in the low stakes version of the story, it's a pretty casual matter, but they decide not to stop in at the bank on Friday. Hannah's pretty confident that the bank will be open tomorrow. And here's her explicit evidence. Since I was there just 2 weeks ago on Saturday morning, so we can deposit our paychecks tomorrow morning. I have to say this is a piece of historical fiction for us now from before the days of direct deposit. And also from, at least when I run this in I can't run this in Canada verbatim, excuse me, because all banks are open on Saturday. I don't know, how is it here? Is it hit and miss, 50-50? Anyway, 50-50 would be good because that would make it a real sort of interesting question. And the idea is you're supposed to think, yeah, she probably does now. In this case, danger, they have an impending bill coming due, very little in their account. It's absolutely crucial that they deposit their check by Friday. They're outside the bank. And again, this explicit evidence that's given for the decision is the same in both cases. Hannah notes that she was at the bank a couple weeks ago. It was open. And then she reaches this judgment that she lacks knowledge that the bank will be open tomorrow. And we're supposed to endorse that. We're supposed to say, yeah, that's right. In this case, she knows. In that case, she doesn't know. And so that's the sort of standard philosopher's response to that. It's intuitive to see low stakes as knowing and high stakes as failing to know, despite the fact that they have the same explicitly stipulated evidence about the bank. And that's supposed to be like philosophically interesting or exciting. These guys, Jason Stanley, perhaps at some point in his career, John Hawthorne, although not anymore, Jeremy Fantle and Matthew McGrath, thought that these cases showed that stakes themselves are a factor in knowledge. Your possession or failure to possess knowledge depends in part on what is practically at stake for you in the decision. And that's supposed to be a surprise because you would have thought knowledge depends strictly on the quality of your evidence and your thinking and whether the proposition that you believe is actually true or not. You might think it just relies on that. No, these guys say it also depends, how much money is in your bank account could make a difference to whether you do or don't have knowledge that the bank's going to be open tomorrow. This is a radical and unusual position because it erodes the traditional distinction between practical and theoretical rationality, and it actually ends up having a lot of philosophical costs because of that. And so in response to that, a number of other traditional philosophers who wanted to take what's called an intellectualist approach in which you deny that practical stakes matter directly to knowledge, the intellectualists agreed that they felt those intuitions. And I think this is something really important. It's really important when philosophers who are in opposed camps share common intuitions. They have some common basis of material that they can talk about. They felt the intuitions, but they thought there's some kind of confusion. Maybe we're just sort of, driven by conversational pragmatics here, or maybe, so Williamson has the idea, maybe in high stakes situations, it's not enough to know, you actually also have to know that you know. If this is a life or death matter, you don't just have to know that you've chosen the right graduate school, you have to know that you've chosen, probably more iterations than that. And so then they'd say, well, maybe we were just kind of getting confused when we said this person doesn't know. It really meant, they didn't know that they know. And these accounts, I think, are interesting. They actually might have part of the truth in them, but I think there's actually a simpler explanation of what's going on in these cases, which I'll get to in a moment. So this is how the interest relative invariantists, like Jason Stanley, and the error theories are seeing the cases. They're seeing the cases as having these basic features. There's a moderate amount of evidence in both of them, and you're shifting from low to high stakes. And the target feature, the feature of interest, is that intuitively our low stakes person knows and our high stakes person doesn't. And this is either a mistake, which is what the errorists think, or it's a demonstration that stakes themselves matter to knowledge, which is what the interest relative invariantist thinks. I think there's a simpler answer. So I think if you look at this case the way it was originally stated, and you have in your back pocket the background that human decision making is generally adaptive, we expect high stakes people to think longer and harder before they make up their minds, then high stakes Hannah over here hasn't made up her mind yet. And actually in this formulation of the case, it's really obvious that she hasn't made up her mind yet. She's saying, I guess you're right, I don't know that the bank will be open tomorrow. In Keith DeRose's original telling of the story, the protagonist gets out of the car and goes to check that I guess you're right, honey. He gets out of the car and goes into the bank to double check the hours. At the moment that he's getting out of the car, which is the moment where we're invited to assess his mental state, it doesn't look like he has a conviction that the bank is open the next day. It looks like he's in that state, that fluid state of weighing evidence and trying to make up his mind. He's not sure. He's going to find out. He doesn't have a belief one way or the other. So lack of belief, like you haven't made up your mind yet, that's a very traditional way to deny knowledge. You don't have to get all fancy pants and go for interest relative invariantism. Okay, partly because of that kind of criticism, people decided to start talking about versions of the case in which it was much more explicitly stipulated that our high-stakes character, despite her burning high stakes and her skimpy evidence, was making up her mind, confident. But the problem here is that if you stipulate that somebody has burning high stakes and skimpy evidence, and she's going ahead and just making up her mind anyway, you're essentially you're telling a story in which someone's coming across as being hasty or distracted, because adaptive thinkers don't usually make up their minds rapidly on moderate evidence. But if you're understanding the story that way, then again, you've got a really traditional reason to deny knowledge in this case. You don't have to go for interest relative invariantism. So, so in the bank cases, the way I see it, we're responding not just to the explicit stipulations, we're also responding to what we infer about the cases thanks to our background knowledge of the adaptivity of human judgment. So in the original cases, the way, for example, Jason Stanley just had them there, I think we'd ordinarily read those cases as involving high confidence in the first case, low confidence in the second. And that's something that you infer from what's going on. And that's a very traditional reason for you to shift from saying knowledge to absence of knowledge. In the amended cases where you have stipulation of explicit confidence in the case, then you have the same moderate evidence and high confidence. It's easy just to focus on the switch in stakes between the cases. But if we can think about what you're inferring from the case when you read it in your ordinary open book way, as well as what's explicitly stipulated, you're going to be inferring that there's an ordinary level of human reliability in the first case and some kind of compromised reliability in the second. And again, that's a very traditional reason for the shift. Okay, so so changing stakes means you're going to be changing inferred traditional factors like confidence and reliability. I don't think you have to go for pragmatism or interest relative invariantism. And these relationships are very well known, and they should be naturally reflected in our intuitive mental state attributions on any of our dominant theories of mental state attributions. And there's actually some relatively direct evidence for that going back to the 70s I can talk about if you want. Now, here's the shocker. You'd expect then that since philosophers found it intuitive, and I'm saying, oh, there's all these reasons you would read these cases this way, you would expect that folk intuitions, when you actually study them experimentally, would reflect changing stakes. And here's a very surprising and puzzling thing. A whole series of very well-conducted empirical tests found only very weak effects. If you actually give people the verbatim Keith Durrell or Jason Stanley cases, you don't get much difference between them. When you ask, does this high-stakes person know? Does this low-stakes person know? They actually tend to say yes to both. They don't tend to go from, oh, well, low-stakes knows, but high-stakes doesn't. And this was brought forward as a suggestion that armchair philosophy is in a lot of trouble, because a lot of armchair philosophy, both from people who believed in the intuitions and from people who were out to debunk them, took those intuitions for granted and assumed that we share them with the folk. Something funny is going on. Let's try and see what it is. When philosophers first read the bank cases, they were reading them as juxtaposed. There's these two cases. Here's the only thing that's different. We're shifting from high to low stakes, trying to interpret the cases as being as similar as you can, being a good sport, reading the philosophy article. And in fact, if you do juxtapose cases with lay people, you actually do get something of an effect. But what about between subjects designs? And I'm going to focus here specifically on ones where at the end of the story, the agent's level of confidence or belief is explicitly stipulated. We want to try to make sense of the story. This is a person who's in a really high-stakes situation, and they're saying the bank is open. One way to make sense of this story is to think that the person actually does know a fair bit about whether the bank would be open, right? It's not in general the case that high-stakes thinkers know less about stuff than low-stakes thinkers do. It's just if you held the evidence absolutely fixed between high and low-stakes thinkers that you get that result, that you get the low-stakes people make up their mind, you give them a couple cues and they're good. The high-stakes people are not satisfied with a couple cues. They want to go on searching. But in general, high-stakes thinkers, because they're in general at liberty to pursue more evidence and think harder about issues, are as likely or better to know about things as low-stakes thinkers are. So here's the between subjects design that Buckwalter pursued, and it's kind of like that Jason Stanley case. Again, the bolded text marks the change in explicit stipulations from low stakes to high stakes. And he found most people saying, yeah, both of in these cases, Bruno knows that the bank will be open on Saturday. But the easiest way to explain this is when you're reading the story, you're trying to make sense of Bruno's entire package of behavior. And so if he's a high stakes guy and he says, no, honey, I know it was open. If he's saying, I was just here last Saturday and it's open till noon, one way you can make sense of what he's doing is to see him as knowing, right? And actually, for what it's worth, in all of these cases, there was, as far as I can remember, there was actually a little bit of an effect. Just didn't achieve statistical significance. I believe actually on, let me see, Felds and Sarbatine found statistical significance when they collapsed all their data together, but a pretty weak effect. And people tended to get results that were numerically in conformity with the standard philosophical intuition, but just but not in a way that was statistically significant. You can actually also get other effects. So Felds and Sarbatine, I think, have another effect going on here, which is there's a little bit of a confusion. Actually, here again, you see. This is a low stakes case. Somebody's about to. Oh, sorry. I put high and low on the wrong side. This is a low stakes case over here. Somebody's about to drive over a little ditch. This is a very high stakes case. Someone's going to drive over a canyon, and again, and the scale's inverted, so that's kind of confusing. People were asked whether they agreed or disagreed, and you have 27% of people inclined to disagree that it was knowledge in the low stakes, and a higher 36, but not significantly, statistically significantly higher percentage of participants disagreeing on the high stakes case. One of the problems they have here is actually something kind of funny. So. I think there may be some confusion here with, so one of the things I'll say here is it's really open-ended exactly how good the evidence is in these two cases. In both cases, there's a phone call, but you're going to try to read the story in a way that this guy's about to drive his truck across the bridge. You're going to try to read the story in a way that accommodates that. So you're relatively likely to. Actually, most people gave a kind of middling response on these. Doesn't seem outrageous in either case that he could have knowledge. There's a little bit of a shift, but not a statistically significant one. There's another problem down here, though, which is that participants are explicitly told, assume that the bridge is safe enough for him to cross. Please indicate how much you agree with the following statement. When John thinks to himself, I know that my truck will make it across the bridge, what he thinks is true. There's an ambiguity in what he thinks, and what that refers to. Is it the embedded, my truck will make it across the bridge, or is it the self-attribution of knowledge? I'm guessing a lot of participants read it as the self-attribution of knowledge there. But just in ordinary speech, what he thinks could pick out either. So if you imagine, I don't know, like Tea Party Charlie saying, I think that Barack Obama was born in Kenya. And I ask you, when Tea Party Charlie says to himself, I think that Barack Obama was born in Charlie, is what he thinks true? You've got, like, if you might take that as a question of, well, how good is Tea Party Charlie at introspecting his own thoughts? Or you might take it as a question about the birthplace of Barack Obama. And so that's another sort of hazard in the way the question's posed. If you're careful to hold the evidence fixed, you actually can detect the effect. And so Angel Penillos has done some work. And I know that actually CUNY's own Wesley Buckwalter has done some follow-up work on this, which in some ways seems to be undermining of Angel Penillos' conclusion, but I don't think it is ultimately. And I can talk about that in question period if you're curious about it. So in Penillos' study, he actually looked directly at evidence collection and looked at how much evidence we anticipate people to collect before we're willing to call them knowers. And he had cases where somebody has to count the number of pennies in a jar, either for a trivial reward or for a massive reward of money that's going to, I believe, give his mother a life-saving cancer operation or something like that. And maybe it wasn't something that big, but it was big. And so people thought that Peter would have to count the coins more frequently if it was a very high stakes contest that he was in, and that just makes perfect sense, right? That we expect people's evidence acquisition behavior to be adaptive. So that's a reflection of that effect. So you do see some kind of state sensitive effects. If you're careful to hold the evidence fixed, and one way you can hold the evidence fixed is by giving people, for example, juxtaposed cases. So I'm saying that intuitive capacities respond to basic features, whether those features are explicitly stated or inferred. And we can't obviously, we can easily, as experimenters, see which basic features we've explicitly stipulated. That's just very easy for us to do. It's harder for us to see or introspect which basic features are getting inferred. Okay, lessons for traditional and experimental philosophy. I see that I've actually gone past, I'm running late, so this is going to be really quick. The Nobel effect presents you with an exquisitely clean minimal pair. Oh, okay. So one of the very, very beautiful things about the Nobel effect is you're just switching one word. Actually, you switch it a few times, but that looks like a perfect minimal pair. You're changing the moral valence of a side effect. You're switching help to harm, oh well, very good. That's important too. Thank you. I didn't even see that. I should have highlighted it. Okay. So that looks like a really, really clean minimal pair, and it's very easy for us to focus on that. And oh shoot, what was I going to say? Sorry. And I think there's been a wave of work lately which has been suggesting that we're probably shifting a lot more than just the valence. So in particular, Alfano, Robinson, and Beebe have been arguing that I think picking up on some suggestions by earlier writers like Tanya Lombroso, that the original idea behind the Nobel effect was that the mental states of the chairman of the board are just absolutely the same between help and harm, except for the moral valence of the side effect. But some critics have argued that actually changing the moral valence of this side effect forces you to change quite a bit of your representation of the mental states of the chairman of the board. And interestingly, it's been suggested that when we read this story, we might not actually even form the belief that, we might not even attribute to the chairman of the board the belief that what he's doing will actually help the environment. Here he is saying, I don't care at all about helping the environment. And when we read this side of the story, Alfano et al. Have suggested that we actually do, when we read this, attribute to the chairman of the board the belief that what he's about to do is going to harm the environment. And if it's a condition on representing intentional action, that you believe that the thing that you're about to do should have that effect if you'll bring it about, then that would be part of the explanation of what's going on here. So the idea is when you read the story, to make sense of it, you have to infer some quite different beliefs for the chairman of the board in these two scenarios, and beliefs that are very directly relevant, and relevant in a very old-fashioned way to whether the action should be represented as intentional. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting about that Alfano, and I won't say this is decisive, I'm just sort of saying this is an interesting thing that James Beebe and Mark Alfano and company have been looking into. And they've just been asking people, basically, does this person believe, and finding a really significant difference between those conditions. It's interesting to me in part because the Nova effect is so incredibly robust and it's been produced with such a broad variety of different materials, some of which actually look like they get really close to stipulating the very thing that Alfano, Beebe, Robinson think is shifting in these cases. So those guys are saying there's a difference between whether you're actually attributing to the person the belief or not. This is from NOVE 2007. The stimuli here are from NOVE 2007 paper on clashing norms. And this is a norm which we recognize as morally dreadful. So it's a case in which norm violation would be the good thing to do. And you can still produce a version of the Nobbe effect where the norm violation comes across as, this should be compliance rather than violation. That's a mistake. The norm violation comes across as intentional, and the compliance to the norm comes across as unintentional, even though we've now crossed the moral valence of the stimuli. And incidentally, I should have presented this a bit more clearly. The reason why Alfano and Beebe think you're attributing these mental states is that when you're about to violate a norm, you're essentially in a high-stakes situation. That's true back in this case as well. If you are in a situation where you're about to violate the norm of taking care of the environment, you're about to harm the environment, you've got a sort of freestanding reason not to do this. And so you'd be expected to think harder about it and actually make up your mind. Whereas on this case, actually it doesn't even matter to this person whether or not the environment is helped, and there's no background reason to avoid doing things that help the environment. So you don't even have to really make up your mind about this. In this case, we have somebody saying, look, I know I'll be fulfilling the requirements of the law. This person is saying, look, I know I'll be violating the requirements of the law. On the Alfano and Beebe interpretation, we actually read this compliance person as not knowing or not having made up his mind, even though he's saying, I know that. And I think this is an illustration. If the Alfano explanation is right, I don't think it's killed by this pair of cases, because it's an illustration of the fact that when you use I know, you're often just using that conversationally. This isn't typically taken as a direction that a mental state attribution is to be made. So for example, if someone says to you on the phone from the customer support line, I know that customer service is very important to you. You don't read this as a statement that, oh, that person knows that customer service is important, right? That's just a conversational use. And so this is something that we discount. So this is getting very close to a case where you're explicitly stipulating something that people discount because of the content. And so I think that's an interesting sort of thing to watch out for. Sorry, my battery's really fading. So I want to say this is not a problem specific to XFI. It's a problem for armchair philosophers as well. I want to say when armchair philosophers like Keith DeRoe started fooling around with the bank cases, they might not have known what kinds of changes they were invoking in people when they shifted from high to low stakes. And I think this is because the operations of our intuitive capacities are relatively mysterious to us, whether we're traditional philosophers or whether we are experimentalists. You can't just introspect what your intuitive capacities are doing any more than you can introspect how, for example, you're able to accomplish face recognition. You can have some sort of crude efforts to detect what you're inferring from what's being stipulated, but the problem is that you've got to be careful with that because those crude efforts to check, are you inferring this, can really backfire. If I ask you, are you inferring this from the case, you can have the sense, well, maybe I shouldn't be. There's various things you can do to try to help yourself out of these problems. I think it's really good to be aware of the background psychological research on story comprehension, discourse representation, and on our target intuitive capacities. And I think actually another thing that's very good is to work on traditional philosophical theory formulation. So to try to approach the whole problem from the other side as well and ask yourself questions like, you know, is the interest relative invariantist theory of knowledge, is that viable as a theory of knowledge? And you can look at considerations of theoretical simplicity and unification to help guide you from that side as well. So I think there's a lot that philosophers can learn from XFI, and I think there's a lot that experimentalists can learn both from traditional philosophy and from the relevant branches of psychology. Thank you.
We're going to have a period of Q&A now. Any questions for Jennifer?
Yeah, so I wondered about the sort of bank cases and going back to like traditional philosophy. So you looked at this as a difference in the confidence levels. I wonder though what you would say though, and looking at like Colin Radford stuff in like the 1960s, right? So there's some,
Oh yeah, I love that stuff.
yeah, so like there's I mean the case is similar in a way, and Radford's someone who wants to say, well, confidence has quite a lot to do with whether or not you've met the belief condition.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have other people who think that confidence doesn't have much to do. So you can rather not have a high degree of confidence in something that you believe in, but you've still satisfied that belief condition. I wondered what you made of this.
Confidence is complicated, and there's a lot of different things that people will mean by it. I don't necessarily mean to suggest that you have to have a lot of really enthusiastic personal phenomenology. I think there are a number of different treatments of confidence that might be compatible with the kind of approach I want to take. Here's the key thing as far as I'm concerned. What I'll count as confident belief formation is really just the crystallization of evidence formation into a fixed result. So when you move from the stage of weighing evidence, searching for what am I going to think here, to the sense of having an answer, when you produce an answer, then you'll count as confident enough in my books. And so it may be actually even that Radford's reluctant student who's asked for the date of the Battle of Hastings or something like that, who's fumbling for it, but then he comes up with something. I'm going to count him as off the hook when he comes up with it, even if he doesn't, even if he's not really robust in his response. But it's sort of an empirical question how confidence affects attributions of knowledge, and there is some work on this. There's empirical work on this. There's actually one piece of empirical work that I feel like I have to share with everybody because it's affected me in a very strange way. So this work is by a psychologist named Brennan, I believe. I can send you the citation later if you want. But you know when you're talking and you sometimes have filled pauses, like you're kind of and sometimes you have silent pauses before you come up with an answer? Yes, it happens. So they had people evaluate whether somebody knew an answer or not. And you know, like how basically how smart do you look? If you are going to come up with the answer, do an unfilled rather than a filled pause. Silence, and then nail it. If you are not going to come up with the answer, try umming a bit, because you actually come across as like there, you come across as like searching and so on and so forth. But it's kind of like an empirical question, like how we register confidence and how we see the relationship between that and states of knowledge or belief.
Right. So
Kripke's got to be the counterexample for that.
But you may have sort of overriding non-intuitive background knowledge that enable you to make those mental state attributions there. I think maybe if a random person had to evaluate Kripke on the subway, it might not be so kind. Don't put this on the web.
Hey, I know you were just introducing this about these particular experiments as kind of a case study for the broader theme, but I thought the ideas you had about the particular experiments were actually really interesting in themselves. So you start out with this experiment from Pineos, where he says that the number of times you have to check varies depending on the states, and then later on you talk about these studies by Alfano and colleagues, where they show that whether something's morally good or morally bad affects whether people think that you believe the relevant proposition.
Yeah.
And within experimental philosophy, those are usually regarded as just two separate experiments about two separate issues. But you were suggesting maybe we could come up with a unifying explanation that's going to be the explanation of both of those findings. So I was wondering, is there something that we could do sort of going forward that could test that hypothesis? The hypothesis that we can find a unifying explanation of those two findings that are usually regarded as separate.
Well, I mean, both of those findings have something to do with something that I take to be an existing item of knowledge, which is that human cognition is adaptive, that higher stakes decisions are handled differently from really low stakes decisions. So I don't think experimental philosophers should set out to do that. That's already been done. Swiss cognitive scientists have done that. We don't have to do that. There are some things we could do about the perception of the stakes involved in norm violation and compliance. That this seems to be kind of common sense to me, that if you're asked, is it a higher stakes matter to do something that might harm the environment, or something that won't harm the environment or that would help it? I think if you have some questions there, you could verify. I mean, that seems to be one of the. I take it that's one of the premises in Alfano, Beebe, and Robinson's approach, that we do tend to treat norm violation as risky behavior, as behavior that requires more thinking. Actually, even if the norm that you're violating is one that's a morally bad norm, it's more hazardous to do it. And then, so I take it we could do some work on that. I mean, it's always possible that these effects, which seem to me to have some superficial similarities, are being driven by each is being driven by a completely different effect. I think if we can find more shifty phenomena that work in a similar fashion, then that would be that would be a good thing. I think, of course, we could also disprove it. I mean, we could maybe find that there's characteristics in the one case that don't apply to the other, or and in fact, people have done work that's critical of Pineos. So Schaffer and Buckwalter have done a lot of work, which I actually find really interesting. And I think I find this kind of work pretty compelling, and I think there are some problems in some of the experiments that Buckwalter and Schaffer have done. For example, they have directly asked, with high stakers and low stakers, both of whom are actually making the right choice in the end about, for example, whether the bank's open or whatever. They've asked people directly, well, okay, so here's what this guy thought, and here's what happened. And they asked people directly, how satisfactory was his evidence on a scale of 1 to 7? People tend to say, pretty good on both sides. And I think somehow, they're saying, look, that goes to show we're not imputing more evidence to the high staker than to the low staker. My own feeling about this is that it's not, you have kind of a problem with the Likert scale there. Like, yeah, your evidence was good enough to get you to the right place, so maybe that's what's really going on. But maybe there could be more sensitive tests of how much evidence you're imputing. I think it's fully possible when we do more work of the kind that Buckwalter and Schaffer are trying to do, that we'll find the adaptive cognition approach doesn't work. right? We can keep going with this and try to figure out, like, what are we implicitly attributing to these people?
Well, there are many pieces of evidence in these cases that it works just as well if you change no to some other word. Like
Right, right. So they go through the whole deontic thing, and I don't have a problem with that. I think what's going on is...
But do you think that would apply in the other case? Like if you said hope against him, that will all case?
well, they do tend to find the same results in a lot of different places. I think actually there's a problem specifically with changing it to guess, that if you change the word to guess, it doesn't make much sense. So people charitably read that as this person didn't mean guess. They mean, like, how much do you reckon we're going to have to do here, right? Because literally, if you try to read it literally, it doesn't literally make sense. So people have to accommodate the question the best they can. I think there's a lot of shallow processing in these questions too, that people, so that's something I've done a little bit of work on. People don't always detect the substitution of near synonyms. I recommend to everybody the work of Tony Sanford at Glasgow, who's done a lot of work on semantic change blindness, where he gives people versions of a story, then with just like one little detail changed, and looking at the conditions under which you do and don't notice the changes. It's amazing the changes you don't notice. And you do notice the ones that are in focus, the ones that are italicized, you're much more likely to notice them. Or you notice ones where there's a lot of semantic difference between the items being swapped out. But if something's non-focal for you, which it would be for many of our naive participants, you can be relatively blind to, did I just ask you about knowledge or belief? Did I just ask you about thinking, hoping, guessing? What is the right mental state to have here? Yeah, I think the sort of deontic stuff, so they try to say, well, really we're looking at what people think this person should do. It's not even connected to something about knowing. I would want to explain that by saying that knowledge is the key mental state which we take to govern action. We think that people ought to act on the basis of their knowledge, and not just. It's not a good idea to act just on the basis of what you randomly happen to think to be the case. So I try to explain it that way.
David?
Hi, thank you for your talk. The general theme kind of reminds me of reader response theory and literary theory,
Mm-hmm.
which, originally developed out of the idea that the meaning of a work of text is whatever readers interpret it as. And even if you don't buy that theory of meaning, a lot of work has gone into it studying, how readers respond to different texts and how you can achieve a certain response if you want it. So I was wondering if maybe in this way experimental philosophers might have things to learn from even literary theorists.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in my own experimental work, I'm working with Raymond Marr, who's a social psychologist at York University, who's done a great deal of work on how we understand fiction and how empathy works when you read and what you learn from it. And I think there's a great deal to be gained by engaging both with psychologists who work on fiction and with literary critics and just looking at literary texts. So there's a lot of really nice examples of what I call echoic use of mental state verbs. When you become conscious of it as an epistemologist, then unfortunately every novel you're reading is going to be like this. But where an omniscient narrator will describe a character as knowing something, and you just know, God, wrong track, right? But that's kind of the frisson of your engagement with the text, that you yourself are put in a position where there's some distance between how the character is being explicitly described and how you have to understand that character. And that's part of the excitement of fiction. And I think it's, definitely something we can learn from our colleagues in literature about.
Again, awesome talk, really informative. I just have a kind of a two-parter, but the first is a clarification. Did you say that when they increase the cognitive load on high-stakes decision makers in the econometric studies, like by making either time tasks, or like by messing with their cognitive load that is increasing it, they perform. How do they perform? What's the change in performance when you give them time restrictions or?
They perform much more like low-stakes thinkers. They'll go through fewer options. They'll feel better about the ones that they're chosen. It's the paradox of unfounded confidence. So actually, if you're a super high-stakes thinker, and I give you all weekend to make up your mind, you're going to make a better decision and feel less confident about it than if you do it absolutely under fire. Then you feel, and so they do all kinds of things. They did some very cruel experiments involving a dot. You put people in a room with a dot matrix printer. Do you guys even know what that is? That makes that noise? Yeah, and then you have to answer a lot of sort of SAT type questions, and you'll feel more confident about your answers. You'll answer faster, and you'll answer worse. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, so I guess the question then becomes, I don't know if this would be interesting at all or even valuable, but it seems like given that you can manipulate people when they're either in a high stakes or low stakes environment to kind of make other decisions of the other sort, couldn't you kind of get these people in the DeRose Bank cases or other cases like that and essentially, for our naive philosophy students answering these questions, put them in a high or low stakes environment and see whether or not that would affect their willingness to maybe ask questions about whether or not in the bank case they really know.
Oh, so are you thinking that we're going to put our experimental participants
Right,
that we're asking
into
to
it.
make mental state attributions
Right.
into different kinds of environments? And absolutely that has an impact on your mental state attributions. So if you're under time pressure and you're distracted, various familiar biases really come out. And some things that are typically seen only in 3-year-olds, you can bring them out in adults if you crank up the time
And
pressure
that's with
high enough.
like
So there is existing work on that. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So I might ask you.
Yeah, sure.
Hi. So this is about your characterization of intuitions.
Yes.
So 2 things. One, I was just wondering if that was meant to be a really principled definition or just sort of a gesture at the sort of things intuitions might be. So yeah, it would be great if you could.
So when so I can answer that really quickly. I think I did a bad job of it, but I do mean this in a very. So I think there is a psychologically real distinction between intuitive and reflective thinking, and I very much follow the work of Jonathan St. Bernard Evans on this. So there's huge clusters of features which are associated with S1, S2, intuitive, reflective, systematic, automatic, however you want to call these different distinctions, right? There's speed, effort, shared with other animals, blah, 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 blah. The question is, like, which one of these things is absolutely fundamental? And the argument that's been advanced in the literature recently, and I think there's sort of increasing consensus around this, is that the fundamental thing has to do with the involvement of working memory, that you can really tell that a task is a task for reflective thinking when it collapses under cognitive load. Because we have this sort of restricted capacity for working memory. So, you're adding up digits in your head. That's an explicit task, and you can't do that very well while simultaneously out loud saying the alphabet backwards or something like that. But you could do it while drumming your fingers on the table. This is an automatic behavior, and it doesn't slow me down in adding up numbers in my head.
But so if intuitions are judgments for which we are not aware of the steps in the reasoning or something
Yes.
like that, it seems like experimental philosophy isn't testing intuitions. Right, because in all of those cases, at least for me, I'm aware of some of the steps in the reasoning.
Good, excellent. But you're not aware of all of them. And in fact, okay, that's an excellent point. What I'm going to say you're aware of is you're aware of a series of features which are feeding into your intuitive calculations. Just as you're aware, when someone raises the question, does she know that there's water in that she's about to pour out? Well, you're aware of my direction of gaze, various things about the object, blah 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 blah. You're aware of that. There's a key step in your reasoning, there's a key step in your cognition, which is not necessarily introspectively accessible to you. The best way I can kind of try to bring this out is as follows. In epistemology, we do these categorizations all the time where we just have a story and we ask, does this person know or merely think? There's 2 ways that you can do this. You can do this according to the dictates of an explicitly given epistemological theory. So I could tell you what Goldman's 1967 causal theory of knowledge says. It says that in order for S to know that P, it must be the case that S's belief that P is produced by the fact that P, or something like that. I'll give you explicit definition, and then I'll give you a story. It could be Goldman 76, the Henry and the Barnes, and I say, according to Goldman's 67 theory, would this be a case of knowledge? There, you would be, your categorization judgment itself would be, I hope, explicit in that you would look at the story and you'd say, yes, okay, this is a case where there's this kind of causal connection, and according to Goldman's theory, knowledge is something which has that kind of causal connection, and you're explicitly clicking the categorization into place according to the stated rule of the definition that you're following. As long as you're doing that, and that's a kind of reasoning that's very familiar to us. We do it in different kinds of contexts. I could ask you, is trespassing a Class B misdemeanor under Texas law? And you would have, if you're a Texas lawyer, some kind of explicit understanding, and you'd see that trespassing falls under that. But as long as you're doing that, you're not generating fresh and exciting knowledge about Class B misdemeanors under Texas law or about knowledge itself, actually. All you're saying is, well, this fits what knowledge is according to Goldman's theory. But as Goldman 76 himself proved, you can discover that you're dissatisfied with an existing theory because you just have this intuitive feeling that this case, although you can see explicitly that it fits theory blah and theory X and theory Y, you just look at this case and you feel like, yeah, but that's not knowledge. That's not knowledge with a capital K, whatever knowledge really is. And you can do that without already having in your back pocket a story about what knowledge is. That's part of the beauty of Getty's 1963 paper. Thank God. He didn't give us an explicit theory. Knowledge is not JTB. Knowledge is JTB plus Q. He didn't do that. He just said, well, here's a counterexample. He didn't have to have his own explicit theory to apply to the case. So he didn't have to do what I would call reflective thinking, where the steps are in that sort of long division or syllogistic reasoning way, all completely explicit in making the categorization judgment itself. You're absolutely right that you're conscious of something as you read through the story and think, wait, but that's the identical twin, and she didn't know that he went home, or whatever. And you're conscious of something there, but you're not performing the categorization itself through explicit reasoning, the way you would in, for example, the legal case.
Thomas?
Oh yeah, so a practical question. So if I wanted to run an experiment on Gettier studies, is it enough if I now change the story to say John is walking and then he's looking at a clock and the clock is not working, but John isn't aware of that. So would I avoid the problems with the Factive?
Oh, you know what? I didn't mean to suggest that that Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch are bad guys for having the Factive there. No, I think actually this is a perfectly legitimate way to tell somebody that a Buick has been stolen. Mm-hmm. He's also not aware that her Buick has been stolen. That part was also not directly, it's totally okay to do this. But I was just trying to make the point that you guys infer it, and you infer it without being aware that you're inferring it, and that's okay, but it's just an illustration of how you pick things up and color things in. And we can absolutely, we're told that this person is doing something good and this person is doing something bad. You infer all kinds of stuff about their underlying mental states as a result of this. I don't know if anyone else has children of an age where they got into these things called the Bionicles from Lego. Does anybody else know about Bionicles? Okay, so one of the things about Bionicles, these are these little sort of robot-y toys from Lego, and you get them and you put them together, is that there's good ones and bad ones. The bad ones are called the Boraks. I hope I got that right. The good ones are called the Mata Nui. Have I got this right? If there's a Bionicle nerd in the audience, please correct me. And what makes them good or bad is the color of the box, basically. and it's so funny because you think no, but surely to be a good person or to be a bad person, you have to, or even a bad Bionicle, you have to have certain beliefs and desires, and there's certain very, very interesting differences between mental states of good and bad people. But actually also, the thing is, this is the thing that really bothers me. If you read the little comic books that come with the Bionicles, you just have the good ones and the bad ones, and they're actually behaving in more or less identical ways. They both want to take over the world and so on, but these are the good people who are trying to get the crystal of power. And anyway. But you don't get to, and as an experimenter, it's really tempting to say, well, this is the red Bionicle over here, and that's the black Bionicle. This one's good, this one's bad. But of course, even as you're trying to understand the Bionicles and play with them, you of course have to attribute all kinds of mental states to them to make sense of that characterization.
Can I just
try and find out what the moral was about the factives and presupposition. I mean, one moral seemed right to me, that presupposition, or whatever you want to call it, can't be about common ground. I mean, it's a way of putting forward new information in the conversation. So this sort of common ground idea doesn't seem to do justice to the very idea of what people have tried to.
You're usually trying to make something common ground in the sense that this is going to be uncontroversial, which is why it is so annoying when you're fighting with someone and they say, look, I know you don't care about your colleagues, but like, doesn't that burn you, right? Because like, we're all taking it for granted now that you don't care about your colleagues, but you could at least, that's a burn, right? And I think it's a burn partly because of the way the way it's being pushed into. Well, this is uncontentious, right? So I think there's something about what the main point of the utterance is.
Right. Okay. That's actually more. Yeah. So now with this, being aware that P, as I say, it's typically regarded as factive.
Yes.
As is, know, regret.
Yes.
These verbs. Now, at one point, I think it was in the next slide, or when you started talking about it as a presupposition, I think. What was it?
Oh, okay. And there's all that brief about is it presupposition
right,
and
now,
entailment?
and then the idea of presupposition being preserved and this intentional negation.
Yeah.
And then this idea that, well, but we've got these cases where, hey, look, it doesn't seem to be preserved.
Oh, okay, right.
Negation.
Right.
And because there were always two stories about this, and I think
Yes,
this is
of
sort
course.
of evidence in favour of the non-popular story, which is the one that, I guess Deirdre Wilson's dissertation, 1975, said, look, what these cases seem to show is in the cases of where you have negation, it's as if it's really you've got the option of an implicature. It's just a sort of scope thing with negation. In the case without negation, it just seems like an entailment. It's, if John knows the P, then P. Right? If John regrets the P, then P.
No, because I think you can still have echoic use there, and so on.
Well, I think that, but you have to put the heavy stress on to get this. I think. So they didn't know. I think it's very hard. I mean, it's something that Lepore and Stone have been working on. It's very hard to get without putting this very special stress or just a general type of prosody on it. You can't really get those readings. So it does seem as if and at one point you did say it was an implicature, and it seemed to me it is a better way of handling it, because you do seem to be able to have this very straightforward cancelability without putting the heavy stress. I mean, it is true that in many cases you say, well, John didn't know that P because it wasn't the case with P. But you just can say, well, no, John didn't know that P because it wasn't the case with P. It seems absolutely fine. John didn't regret the P because John didn't regret killing Batman because he didn't kill Batman. It seems absolutely fine. Right, so.
But you wouldn't say it out of the blue unless you were in a conversational context where someone was essentially insinuating that
insinuating that somebody, or that
Batman regret. Was it Batman?
Well, whatever. So I was struggling to find what the moral was you were pulling out of the discussion of the.
Well, actually, okay. Here's my secret moral that. I've been doing experimental work lately where I've looked at what people say about a bunch of really closely matched cases. So for example, just Russell's stop clock getting a case, and then matched variants of that example. So there's a variant matched for word length, matched in all kinds of ways, where somebody's looking at a clock and everything's normal. And do they know that it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon? And then cases where it's a justified false belief, let's say. They're looking at a clock that's broken and showing the wrong time. Do they know that it's 3? And the story explicitly stipulates that it's 3:30, and they pass a comprehension screen question saying that they know it's 3:30. And a shocking number of people will go ahead and, depending on how you frame the question, 15-20% of people will go ahead and attribute knowledge in these cases. And I see this as performance error, and very much to my dismay, some people have been picking this up and saying, oh no, this is a sign. The verb to know isn't really factive. And I think that's a disaster, right? And I think anybody who starts peddling that kind of theory really owes us, they're going to have to actually do a lot of repair work on discourse comprehension and so on generally. We've got very, very strong background reasons to believe that no is factive if you just look at how the flow of information works in conversation and so on. So I've been thinking about this because I'm because I'm paranoid, and because I'm paranoid, I mean, I'm worried that it's actually not easy to test exactly how factive verbs work, partly because of what goes on when you ask questions about them. I prefer testing these things in sort of indirect ways. I mean, there's ways of, for example, giving people little mysteries to solve, where you have, I always do this first day of my epistemology class. I give people little mystery stories larded with factive and non-factive verbs, and I get them to deduce who the killer is or something like that. And they typically then have trouble explaining exactly how they did it. But you can get people to deploy their knowledge that you can detach after a factive verb, in a sense.
There's many cases which you can get this to work very nicely. I mean, especially with, say, just found out that. So, why is Susan so happy? Or Susan just found out that Tom was promoted, and you know the addressee is dying to find out whether Tom was promoted. Was Tom promoted? It's a very natural way of now saying, oh, that was the information you were trying to get across.
Yeah, and I think actually there's some very interesting differences between thick and thin factives under negation as well. And this is all very complicated territory. And I don't know very much about Lawrence Horn and metalinguistic negation. I don't know very much about that. I would like to know more, and I could, this is, you know, I'd certainly not publish on this without doing a lot more research on it. But I'm interested in this kind of corpus work on how people actually use factives. I think can be pretty instructive for us as philosophers and as experimentalists. So I've been trying to do some work like that, like just looking at the relative frequencies of different constructions. Do people use to what extent are people using first person, third person attributions of knowledge, for example? And what are the differences in the kinds of contexts in which people use first person and they go third person? Are all first person use is just conversational? It's a good question.
More questions?
I just wanted to clarify something, jumping off of your answer to Zoe's point and the stuff with the high stakes. Are you saying, just, I mean, really just to clarify, are you saying something like the mechanism that generates intuitions, that it's not going to be subject, that it's not going to be happening or talking to or dealing with working memory faculties, and B, that because it's not dealing with working memory in a strong sense, that it's not sensitive to cognitive load effects? That is to say, people will give the same intuitions given all sorts of manipulations of their cognitive load. Is that what your answer was? Did your answer entail those 2 points about the intuitive mechanism?
Oh, I see. So you're suggesting if mental state attribution is really intuitive, then performance shouldn't suffer.
Well, I'm saying if it's intuitive and if it's separate from, or really kind of if there's a strong separation, a large separation between whatever mechanism is responsible for giving you these intuitions and whatever mechanism deals with syllogistic reasoning or these kinds of things, or number manipulation, i.e. some robust working memory faculty, and if those two are really distinct, then impacts the working memory, impacts to like increasing cognitive load, which disrupts working memory, shouldn't disrupt the intuitive mechanism, right?
I think in principle there's something to that line of questioning, and the quick answer is that the answer is not a quick answer. It's actually very complicated. I think there are a large number of different cognitive abilities involved in mental state attribution, and the key thing is something about our consciousness of the processing. But it can certainly be the case. Look, hey, to construe these stories, you have to have a sequence of explicit and introspectively available thoughts about them. That all has to be set up. And also even to track what's going on with somebody in your environment, depending on how complicated the scenario is, you may have to have a lot of explicit thought about what's going on, even if the judgment is presented automatically. It's actually very controversial in psychology right now, the conditions under which mental state judgment is more automatic or more.
It seems like it's going to be very hard to get the case where you don't have any working memory even in its phone.
Yeah, but my analysis, so my analysis of the difference between these cases is I'm not saying we make a low stakes mental state attribution in S1 and a high stakes mental state attribution in S2. I'm not saying that.
Right. Wait. So what are you saying? Sorry.
Oh, so I'm saying when we look at this story, we naturally, as a result of automatic intuitive calculations we make, anticipate more evidence collection over here, and when evidence collection is held constant, lower confidence over here than over here.
So
that's what
the
we
automatic
automatically anticipate.
Not the fact that that guy's in a higher stakes and that one's in a lower stakes.
Well, that's, yeah, I mean, the reception of that would be processed the same way in the two cases. Yeah.
So just to
Yeah,
this is
Meryl.
another follow-up. So does that also means that intuitions, or we can't tell whether or not something is an intuition just by knowing that there is a question posed in a particular way and someone gave a particular answer. We might have to know more about that individual. It seems like there are cases
Absolutely,
where-
absolutely.
Okay.
And so, for example, one of the things I can do if I become very committed to a particular theory of knowledge is you ask me a question, is this knowledge or not? And I sit there and I think about my theory and I say, yeah, it is. And there I'm no longer using intuitions as a check on my theory. I'm using my theory as a way of getting me out of the hellaciousness of having to generate an intuitive response. And maybe Craigie Hitchcock tells me people do this with causation, that, you know, when he goes to Egal Kfard and he asks him, okay, is this situation, is this a causal relation here? You can bet your booties that Egal's going to give an answer which is going to be basically generated by Egal's theory. So it's a worry, sure. But it's also possible for epistemologists, like Alvin Goldman himself, to come up with responses that totally undercut theories that they themselves used to be really committed to. Intuitive, and it's possible for, so you know, Williamson feels the intuitions that motivate contextualism. He hates contextualism, but he feels them. I feel them too. And that's embarrassing and awkward for me, and it puts burden of work on me to try and explain it away. But it's one sign that your devotion to a theory is not necessarily going to contaminate all of your intuitions. You're capable of having intuitions that are strangely and sometimes informatively opposed to your theory. And maybe I'll come around one day to accepting the truth of contextualism. You know, if I can't do a good job of explaining away the intuitions that I'm saddled with, yeah.
But you can also train yourself in, and then you give intuitive responses
That can
from
absolutely.
the theory that you
Yes, yes.
So
There is a risk of that, and I think it's good for that reason to keep mixing it up with fresh examples. So I've been spending a lot of time lately reading medieval Indo-Tibetan epistemology, which is extremely rich in Gettier cases and so on. And it's refreshing to me. You know, you're tired of the fake barns. Well, try the case of the goat and the sword for a change, and see if that works for you. And sometimes just our familiarity. You know, you can have fake barn doesn't know because you've taught epistemology 333 a few too many times, and then it's refreshing to work with different materials. And actually, sometimes you might find that there's something in the materials which is maybe a little bit defective. So that's actually a concern I have sometimes with replication, that that we keep using the Pontiac and Buick case, and that's cool. But I think it's really good also to try and reach out for a huge diversity of other materials. If an effect is really robust, you should be able to find it when you're talking about cars and sports and purchasing jewelry and telling the time, and you know, you should be able to vary up those. That's not a point against replication. It's just a plea for more fresh material, and partly to keep us from getting too contaminated with our old intuitions.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had like any pragmatic suggestions for how people can tell what kinds of things they're implying with their descriptions of the case. I mean, as you said, because we don't know, or it's hard for us to tell which things are explicitly stated by the words and which things we're just inferring. It sounds like in some cases it could be quite difficult for us to make sure that we're not inferring anything.
I don't think we can necessarily make sure of everything in advance, because this is all, I mean, partly because we don't fully yet understand how our intuitive capacities are working. What are they actually responding to? So face recognition turns out to involve all this weird stuff about the geometry of the jaw or something like that. Who knew? And so we can't necessarily figure it all out in advance. I think one very good thing to do is to start by looking at the relevant at the work already in psychology in the relevant domain. So look at work in psychology on what happens in human judgment and decision making as stakes shift, and you can find a lot of work on perceptions of shift there. So that can be fruitful, but you may have to keep messing around. Actually, I would like to know, Josh, you might know this. So when Beebe and Alfano and Robinson, Christ, where's the Nobe effect? When they came up with the idea that what's really driving the bus here is actually whether the chairman even believes, that was surprising because we'd read these and we had assumed, of course, in both cases the chairman knows that the side effect is going to be produced, and that's maybe like we're looking down at this from the experimenter's perspective, and you want it to be the case that this information transfer went just the way you as the experimenter would have it go. I guess there was a study, was it Surian and Pellets? Yeah, I wasn't going to try to say that. So they actually did something which was kind of relevant to them. But do you know how they came up with that idea to say, oh wait, maybe it's the belief that's really the thing? Yeah, how did they have that insight? Because that's something like, it's a question, how did they figure, like that's relevant to what David's asking. How do you figure out that actually, secretly, you're not aware that you're doing this? You're inferring something different in these two cases, especially when they're presented between subjects. You're inferring something different about what the mental state of the chairman is.
I guess the thing that came first was just that in the latter case, the harm case, people think he knows that he will harm the environment more than in the health case.
Mm-hmm.
And then all the theories that were supposed to explain why that happens involve the idea that holding fixed that you believe it equally in these two cases, there's just something about the latter case that belief will count as knowledge.
Yeah.
And then they would think, wait, maybe there's some deeper
people
thing.
even
It's
believe?
not just that you believe it equally, but you only know it in the latter case. Maybe you don't even really believe it in the former.
Yeah,
So
and
what
it's
happens if
easy.
you actually insert explicitly, well, I don't know one way or the other whether that's true or not, but I don't care at all about it.
Then you should have an exacerbation of the effect, I would presume.
Do you?
I have no
About
idea.
whether you believe it.
Well, no, if you just explicitly exerted it into the chairman's remark.
But and then in the latter
It
case,
does
if he said, well, I don't
Okay,
really
I
know.
don't really know one way
Then
or the
does he
other.
believe it? We could try it right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be the best case.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's also the problem that when people talk about harming or helping the environment, what their utterances are not always taken at face value. So you could see the person who says, I don't know whether this will harm the environment. It's like, yeah, he knows. He's just saying, I don't know, maybe it won't. You know, there are a lot of problems here about. So you might want to have him not say something. You might want to stipulate something about him. We're going to have to be careful with this, but it's a great idea.
I really liked your insight that as experimenters or as philosophers, there's sometimes a tendency to get into this tunnel vision, and it's because of the point of view that we have as kind of having the pan out, taking a step back and seeing both perspectives, and that sometimes the subjects in the experiments don't necessarily get that view. And it reminded me of another talk, the empathic perspective taking. And the way I see it is that sometimes if you just only see one account, you're a subject in an experiment, you try and put yourself in one of the two situations, either high stake or low stakes, and it just doesn't, you still can't really put yourself in that situation. But when you see them contrasted, when you see that difference, then you realize, okay, the circumstances now, I feel them more. They're impinging. I see what the difference, what the contrast might be, whereas if you were solely in one perspective, you wouldn't be able to.
I think that's a very perceptive comment. I think that's really good. One of the things we can look at is we can look at individual differences in empathy, right? So that was something I tried to do in my work on getting case recognition. So some people score higher in empathy than others, and that's correlated with their task performance on registering other people's mental states and so on. If you're a higher empathy individual, and you have one of these kind of gray zone borderline cases, you'll be more likely to see the target as justified in what they believe, maybe because you're better at stepping into their shoes. But that's definitely something that you can investigate empirically.
Zoe? Yeah, so in your response to Marilyn, it seemed like you were implying that if a subject has memorized how the theory will apply and can just shoot it out, then that's going to count as an intuition.
It
And
could,
seems
it could.
It would according to your definition, but here's a story where it seems really absurd. So I go to my first philosophy class, my first ethics class, and someone gives me a trolley problem, and it's the fat man version. And I say my intuitive judgment is, no, it's horrible to throw the fat man onto the tracks.
Yeah.
Fast forward 2 years, I've read a lot of John Stuart Mill, and I've become a consequentialist.
Yeah.
And I've also read and talked about the trolley problem many times.
Mm-hmm.
And now you ask me, you give me the trolley problem and say, what's your intuitive judgment? Should you throw the fat man over? And my response just pops out, yes, of course I should throw the fat man onto the tracks. So that really doesn't seem like an intuition to me. It just seems like it's a very fast application of a theory, and just because I'm not going through all the steps doesn't mean I should call it an intuition.
Do you think there's a special phenomenology associated with intuition? Is that what's missing for you? Or do you think...
No, I think it seems like what you've offered might be a necessary condition for intuitions, but maybe it's not sufficient. It seems like there are other judgments where you're not aware of all the stuff.
Okay, so I think awareness is sort of a fallible test so whether people can report that they're aware of something. That's a little bit of a fallible test for the involvement of working memory, like strictly, technically. If there was some working memory involved, you might not be, interestingly enough, aware of that you had exercised it. One of the things we're not typically aware of is whether we are engaging working memory or not for solving a problem, interestingly. Like, that would just be one more nuisancey thing to have to pay attention to. So, so I think I would need to hear much more from you about why it is that you feel that the very, very well-rehearsed judgment wouldn't be an intuition. I think, I don't know if you have something you can say.
Yeah, so it seems like it really is relying on inferences that you were explicitly aware of in the past, and you don't need to make them at this present moment because you've made them before and memorized that that's the way the process should go.
Okay. That counts as, even though its causal genesis is in past explicit inference, I see no reason why it couldn't count as, at this point, this is intuitive for you. I think it won't have the same, should not have the same epistemic role in theory construction as a pre-theoretical intuition would.
Oh, I just had it was just an idea I had for trying to get out what implications people might take. It seems a lot of these deal with, people, these characters in these stories doing things, and they try to make sense, and they sort of guess things about these characters' personalities and attitudes in order to make sense of their actions. So one thing you could do is maybe before giving it out, give these stories to a few people and give them open-ended questions describe the chairman of the board, or what do you think of the chairman of the board, or something.
Yeah, and I think, Josh, you've done that kind of work, right? Like, you've elicited people's judgments about, yeah?
About the personality, ask them
Like,
to
you get them to
describe
make
the
all kinds of
characters.
trait attributions to the person.
What the
To
main
the,
result coming out of that kind of work is just that the trait attributions have no impact on it. It's
Yeah.
just their moral judgment about this behavior, not their
Yeah.
moral judgment about whether he's a good guy or something.
Well, not necessarily. You don't necessarily ask them, what do you think of the chairman of the board? Is he a good person or not? But you ask them, just sort of open-ended, describe the chairman of the board, describe his attributes or something, and not necessarily give a value judgment.
yeah, that might not be a bad thing to do. Something that Tanya Lombroso did, which I thought was very telling, was she thought, there's a sense in which norm violations are much more informative for you than norm compliance, right? Norm compliance, who knows, who can tell? Norm violations, that really does, in a sense, tell you more about this guy. So she found people were willing to make much stronger predictions, in this case, of future behavior than they were in that case. So that is something along the lines that you're suggesting.
Yeah. I'm just curious whether there's a way to make the subjects read stories like the way they read train tables.
I know, right? Yeah.
Well, I'm not asking because the GRE reading test. I don't know if you know that, but they really seems like they are meant to be read as train tables. You
Yeah.
have the option that something, whether it's true or false according
Yeah.
to the historical view, also an
Yeah,
option
and
that it's
don't
not
get
mentioned.
creative. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering whether if you insert that into the
Yeah,
comprehension
okay.
test,
So I have had these experiences, like trying to do empirical work, where you just want to grab your reader by the scruff of the neck and read it this way, and it's really hard to do. In fact, so I teach these really big classes in Toronto, and I have clickers for my students. I ask multiple choice questions, they click the answers. And the funny thing is, I've had this experience of putting up, I don't know if you guys know Keith Lair's Have It and No Got case. It's a case in which there's a person called Have It who has a Ford, and a person called No Got who does not have a Ford. And I have a question at the bottom of the screen. Who has a Ford in this story? A, Have It, B, No Got. And I will not get 100% saying, I get like 95%. Keith Lair says you should change his name to Have a Ford, having a Ford. Yeah, but even there. So yeah, it's very hard to get people to read things exactly the way you want. This is actually something that I think developmental psychologists have done some really neat work on. So they've got people to do the following. I have to figure out how I'm going to operationalize this, but this is testing children's understandings of factives. They ask the kids to pretend you are saying the following sentence. Keith knows that Bob bought a new skateboard. Pretend you're saying that. And then they'll ask, okay, did Bob buy it? And then pretend you're saying the following statement. Keith thinks that Bob bought a new skateboard. Okay, did Bob buy a new skateboard? So they try to get you to pretend to say something. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but maybe that is something that could get you out of some of the pragmatics, is if you could make somebody pretend that they were a certain kind of character. I know Hugo Mercier has done some really lovely work where he got people to pretend that they care about an issue, and so he tried to get people to pretend that you have a stake in the matter, and then people gave a sort of more accurate reading of the story. I think we certainly know quite a lot about conditions that improve and deteriorate the understanding of arguments. Of logical reasoning. So if you put people in certain kinds of social situations, they understand arguments much better. I would like to know more about how you can get story comprehension to go down really well. But part of the problem is when we are doing mental state attribution and we're figuring out, what does this person know? What do they think? What do they want? Typically we are doing that very much in an open world environment, right? We're not doing it where you're meeting some computer who has like a data output of the objects that they are looking at and the muscle motions that they're making. So if you want something that's ecologically realistic and capturing our intuitive capacity the way it ordinarily works, you keep finding yourself back in that open world position. But you can get some kind of funny effects from this. So in one of my studies, I had a lot of filler questions. One of my filler questions, I wanted to have more questions where, I had testimonial knowledge transmission and perceptual. I had a bunch of cases. I realized I didn't have that much with deductive reasoning. So I had a detective go through some reasoning about who committed a crime. And I wrote this little mini story, so it was just crystal clear there were only 3 suspects, and this person's got to be ruled out, and that person's got to be ruled out, lots of factive verbs. And then I had, so the detective knows that this person is the killer. And 95% of my participants gave the answer, no, he doesn't. And I was just like, why? And I asked my son, who was 12 years old at the time and pilots all my work, and he always gives the right answer, but on that one, actually, he'd gone with the majority. And I asked, so why, Alex? Why are you saying this? Isn't it obvious when you do the deduction? And he's like, Mom, you read a story like this, whenever it really looks overwhelmingly like one person did it, you can bet that's not the guy. Right? And so it's just like he's like suffering from the effect of all these Hardy Boys novels that he's been reading. I told my psychology collaborators about this, and they laughed at me for expecting that anyone would do closed world reasoning on a case. People don't do that. So you can have these genre effects, unfortunately.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm not very familiar with the literature in epistemology in the Tibetan literature, but from what I've read, one of the claims that I find more provocative is that some people think that, so you've made some claims about our introspection and about how our intuitions are very opaque to us, especially in these cases of knowledge. But some authors in the Tibetan tradition seem to think that people can actually get better at that, at their introspection. And they can not only get better at knowing when people know things, but also at their own psychological processes behind their intuitions. So do you think there's any evidence to think that this might be true, and might it be relevant for this literature?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's certain kinds of task where introspection could be something that could improve over time. But if the key feature of your processing is not going through working memory, introspection will always be silent about it. It's always going to be below the radar. It's like these computations you make when I recognize you as Carissa. I'm apparently doing this on the basis of some freaky geometry stuff about you, and I couldn't explain it if I tried. But and no amount of introspection is going to make it possible for me to bring that up to the surface. So I think introspection has some limitations about the kinds of cognitive processing that it can reveal to us. Introspection, though, may reveal some interesting things. Maybe some of the effects that we feel around things like conversational pragmatics, you could get better at detecting over time if you trained yourself in various ways and read enough Grice or something. I think maybe you could get better that way. That might be cause for hope.
Any more questions? We have maybe time for one more. Jesse.
Does anyone just show a video to these subjects instead of telling a story?
Oh, absolutely. So it works the same way, whether you tell a story or just like face recognition works the same way. If I bring Tom Cruise in the room, or I show you a picture of him, or even to show you a really good cartoon, you're going to recognize who that is. So my collaborator Raymond Marr has done a lot of work, including sort of fMRI work, where he's compared how people respond to live action movies and how people respond to very, very nicely matched sort of cartoon depictions of the same interactions. So it's the same capacity. Sometimes live action brings it out a little sharper. You can get differences in performance, but it doesn't actually matter whether you give people a narrative stimulus or you give them a live action thing to evaluate.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you.